All right, well, the town of Steubenville, Ohio, has been bitterly divided for months by the sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl by two stars of the town's high school football team. Now add to the complex mix of athletes, privilege, alcohol, social media coverage of the conviction.
The verdict was guilty today for two Steubenville, Ohio high school football players.
After a juvenile court judge declared them guilty of raping a 16-year-old girl at a party, Trent Mays and Malik Richmond broke down, sobbing in the arms of their parents. Then, before sentencing, they offered apologies.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to fight.
Richmond's emotional apology struck a chord with CNN's Poppy Harlow.
It was incredibly emotional, incredibly difficult even for an outsider like me to watch what happened as these two young men that had such promising futures, star football players, very good students, literally watched as they believed their life fell apart.
That empathy was echoed several minutes later by Candy Crowley.
You know, Paul, a 16-year-old now just sobbing in court, regardless of what big football players they are, they still sound like 16-year-olds.
And with that came howls of protest on Twitter. "You should be ashamed for siding with convicted rapists," blasted one. "Your coverage is bizarre," ranted another. Soon enough, an online petition demanded that CNN apologize for your disgusting coverage of the Steubenville rapists. CNN struck a new tone the next day.
It's like you're crying now only because you're going to be incarcerated, only because you got caught.
Whether demonizing the perpetrators is an improvement is debatable. Meanwhile,
and many people here are expressing outrage that so many underage teenagers were drinking so much alcohol that night, and no parents or adults did anything to stop them.
Maybe that's where the outrage belonged all along.
Well, first of all, this was a vile and disgusting crime, and if anybody doesn't know the details of it, I implore you to go and find them out for yourselves, because it went well beyond just the night of events. It, translated into social media the next day, and there was a lot of mockery, and one of them lied about telling the girl that she was fine, and actually he was the one who was doing most of the stuff, so it was disgusting. That said, I really don't have a problem with somebody with the background of a Candy Crowley or Poppy Harlow putting this kind of thing in context. Poppy Harlow was at the trial day in and day out. So people were basically responding to the conviction, which was over the weekend. She was there all week and saw the interaction in the courtroom. This is not the first time that the media has made a sort of broad-based observation about these kinds of crimes. It happens all the time. When that Whelan case happened, when it broke and during the conviction, it was pointed out that Nathaniel Fujita's life was ruined also. His family's life was ruined. It may be an obvious thing to say. It doesn't make it more sympathetic, although it may come out that there's a truism to it. Whether it appears sympathetic or not, it happens to be true.
You know, that was not a great moment for Poppy Harlow, but not much long after that, in the same segment, she spoke about the victim in the words that the people who've been protesting against CNN, exactly what they would have wanted to hear from her. Mm-hmm. But that's not what's been posted to YouTube, and that's not what everybody's talking about. I do think that was not a great moment in the history of CNN, but it's a moment taken in isolation. There's been a lot of other coverage. We should keep our focus on the victim, absolutely, but I do think that for the most part, the news media have done that. By the way, similar situation has just cropped up in Connecticut.
I saw that in Torrington.
And the Torrington Citizen Journal had actually grabbed some of the tweets and ran them with the names of people who are attacking mocking this 13-year-old rape victim. Mm-hmm. And I say good for them.
You know, there's a couple of things about this case. First of all, it drives me nuts when the hyperbole in these rape cases, the victim's life is ruined. Well, most of the time, happily, it's not ruined. Most of the time, she's going to recover and she's going to go on to have a very nice life. The perpetrators' lives are not ruined. Maybe they're going to do 5 years in jail, but their lives are not ruined. That's one thing. I hate it when we say that because it implies that you never recover from a sexual assault. It's a very bad message to send. The second thing is, I think people all the time, I've covered murder trials where you look at the murderer who's about to be convicted, you look at him for 2 weeks, especially if he's a kid, and you look at this family or no family, and you begin to have a certain empathy with the murderer because the victim is not there. And that's the third thing about rape cases. The reason this young woman was not there and the reason we didn't hear from her family and all these kinds of things is because we in the media have decided not to use rape victims' names. And I get that, but it adds to the stigma. And as a reporter, you can't report on the travails of the victim or her family if they're not going to talk to you. So I think those who are concerned about violence against women should be trying to encourage some of these women to come forward, because the more you come forward, the less the stigma around the crime.
That's why I was so impressed with Lara Logan from CBS News, who a few years ago, was it 2 years ago, she came out and was incredibly open and honest and graphic about what happened to her in Egypt. And I think she hopefully opened up a space for other victims of sexual assault and rape to be able to be honest, to take away that stigma, because you're right, and it does sound like a lot of the news coverage in Steubenville did talk about the victim, but when the lawyers for the perpetrators have an opportunity to really explain the entire and kind of control the narrative, and you don't hear as much from the victim, and you don't get to associate a name with the victim, it makes the coverage lopsided to begin with.
All right, well, I got a lot of, first of all, I don't know that sexual assault victims' lives aren't ruined. You can manage that pain, you can manage that experience, perhaps with a lot of counseling and other things, but I don't know that you're not emotionally ruined. So that's not a statement I would make.
Well, I would argue with that. I would argue with that.
I don't think what people put, I think there's a lot of pain and loss that people may manage, but I don't know that it doesn't affect you forever.
Then that's a life sentence you're giving those
That's
people.
Exactly right. And I'm not, that's why the lead on this kind of story ought to be the victim. I take your point about whether victims speak or not, or whether their families speak or not. That's our responsibility, to put the emphasis on the victim. I think in some of the cases in the coverage of this, we saw an even balance. And it's okay to say, these are 16-year-old young men, that's going to mean something to them. This is going to mean something to them. I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem with your leading with it. They are not the victim. You lead with the victim, then you can tell me about what it's going to mean for them in their lives. And I think that's perfectly appropriate. Now, and that's where I really think that CNN went off the rails there. You can have full context and have everybody's situation outlined, but don't forget the victim. And to your point, the prosecutors or the defendants' lawyers were extremely sophisticated in putting those young men out. They did all kinds of interviews. So there was lots of people who knew them and their story. So when the breakdown happens, and I'm not saying it was phony, then you get a response from the millions of us who've seen them now in several interviews. But I think we have a responsibility to focus on the victim.
Because you're always very sensitive about how people are characterized, what kind of adjectives are used.
That's right.
These guys were always characterized as football players, but it suggested that they have some kind of immunity or privilege, or they're above it all. I found that offensive. What's it got to do with the fact that they're football players?
Well, in Steubenville, it was also, when the stories that I saw that were fully contextual made the point that football was king there. So they were privileged. That was appropriate.
But there's an automatic assumption that means that you're above it all. And that doesn't,
I think in Steubenville it did mean that. That's what I saw as in the full contextual stories. I'm not saying, I would agree with you if this was just randomly put out there in another case. But in Steubenville, the point had been made that football was king, and those who played it, these young men, were thought to be privileged. So all I'm saying is, and I'm always about paying attention to the language, but I think our focus should always be first the victim, then tell me the rest of everything that's going on. I just feel very strongly about that, and I think that some people fell down, not everybody, because some people did a great job covering the story.